I'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. This is Tuesday, November 17th, 2020. It is 7:12 p.m. and this is a meeting of the Climate Action and Resilience Committee of the Bloomington Common Council. I'm joined by other committee members, Council members Piedmont Smith, Dave Rollo, and Kate Rosenbarger. And we are meeting tonight to discuss the City of Bloomington's draft climate action plan. We have with us Lauren Travis, the Assistant Director for Sustainability for the city, and I believe she has a presentation prepared for us. So we'll first do that and then have questions from committee members before going to public comment, and then back to committee members for any additional questions and final comments. And that is the whole of our agenda this evening. So with that, unless there are any questions, I'll go ahead and let Ms. Travis take it away. Mr. Rollo, go ahead.
May I ask just very quickly, Lauren, is this presentation essentially what I heard last week at BCOS?
It's similar, but not identical. The BCOS meeting was recorded too, so I can reference that as well. Well, thank you for having me. I apologize about all of the delays. So tonight we are discussing the climate action draft, and if you're interested in pulling it up during the presentation, the link to the page is below at bloomington.in.gov Sustainability 2020 Climate Action Plan. You can either download it as a chapter or in full. So I just wanted to start and ground ourselves about where we've come from with climate action and then what role this plan plays within that. So back in 2016, Mayor Hamilton made a commitment to uphold the principles of the Paris Climate Agreement. And part of that was a commitment to reducing greenhouse gases, but also making sure that we're prepared for the effects of climate change and tracking our progress towards that goal. And then last year, many of the council members were present, not the new ones, when the presentation of the most recent greenhouse gas inventory, and that really accounts for where the pollution is coming from in Bloomington, which sectors, and how much it's reduced over time. So this year, at the beginning of the year, we knew that we were working with a consulting firm, Pale Blue Dot, who's worked with other small municipalities like Dubuque to create a climate action plan. And this really intends to set a concrete quantitative target. So if you're looking at the top graphic, we made the commitment, we've done some assessment of impacts, and then looking to set and assess our targets and goals and develop actions and strategies to address them. So that's where we sort of are. This is a common framework that many cities have followed to try to is posing. And to just give a background also, this is something that many different municipalities across the country are engaged in. Dubuque just finished actually a climate action and resiliency plan. Their goal is to reduce emissions 50% from a 2005 baseline by 2030. Ann Arbor adopted on June 1st actually of their first plan to go for carbon neutrality, so no pollution by 2030. And then other cities like Iowa City have a climate action and adaptation plan. And then Dane County, where Madison is, also completed one this year. So we're in good company. Even though we just have a draft at this point, we're working towards something that has been a appropriate framework and helpful for many cities in really reducing their emissions. So in September, I presented in front of council the climate vulnerability impact assessment. And you can see, just for those of you that weren't present at that presentation, that we expect a couple of different impacts to hit Bloomington, especially hard in the next decade. So heat stress, increasing high heat days, impacts to air quality, and stormwater management, and then some other ones to be less prevalent. So that's also part of the climate action plan. If you're wondering about how exactly climate change will impact Bloomington, there's a great section on that as well. It starts on page 10 of the report. So in terms of this draft plan, one of the important components of it was to set a very concrete emissions reduction goal. And so recent reporting shows that global emissions need to be 25% lower than they were in 2018 to put the world on the best pathway to keep global warming below 2 degrees centigrade globally. And so with Bloomington's emissions profile, to remain compliant with what we've agreed to under trying to uphold the Paris Agreement and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, we're on a good trajectory so far to keep in line with that, but we must further reduce our emissions by about a quarter by 2030, so across the next decade. And then that would represent an entire 40% reduction from 2005. And this hits across different sectors. So on the right, and this is a graphic from the draft plan, shows that if we follow the strategies outlined in the plan, most of the impact or effort needs to be focused on buildings. And that's partially because of where our electricity is sourced from. So a reduction of 80 or 82% of the reduction share would be in the buildings and energy, and then 11.9% in transportation. So this next slide shows exactly what that looks like. So back in 2008, we had about 1.5 metric tons. Actually, as Bloomington's population has increased, our emissions have decreased. So that's great news. We've kind of decoupled those two things. And we're on track to meet a 28% reduction by 2025 to this point, though to really make sure that we're continuing to be in alignment with what needs to happen to address global warming, it would be 40% by 2005. The good news is that there's great potential cost savings by implementing the plan measures. So the estimate is that if we were to implement the recommendations from the plan, that there would be cost savings equivalent to about $396 million. And that's estimated by, saving money from electricity costs, et cetera. And that's across the community as well. So the plan is broken into a series of different chapters, and the easiest way to think about it is about 4 of the chapters are mitigation based, so reducing pollution, and 4 are more adaptation based. The ones that are more focused on pollution reduction in particular have more quantitative goals, while things in health and safety, et cetera, are more qualitative in nature. So while this was slated to be completed this year, there were some delays to get to the draft phase. We were hoping to have completed a draft by September, but we put the project on pause for a couple of months. And then we had focus groups with folks in the planning team, and these people are experts in a variety of different fields. So we had some people from Bloomington Transit and the district and Greater Indiana Clean Cities and some economic development representatives to try to give perspectives on what might be good strategies in these different categories. And then at the same time, back in March, there was the community-wide survey that went out, climate survey, and we had about 441 responses to that. And then some listening sessions that were held by community members with a set of community members, and those happened virtually. So there was a series of both focus groups over 3 months in the summer, and then all of those ideas, as well as looking at plans from across the country and strategies from across the country, were utilized to come up with these particular recommendations. So this is just an example of one of the goals, and increasing energy efficiency. How we'll get there, and then how.
Sorry, Lauren, to interrupt. This is the second time. You've cut out for just a little bit. If you could just repeat the last 20 seconds or so when you're talking about this goal, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is just to give an idea, as you're looking through the plan, what the anatomy looks like. So for energy and built environment, which is a really important sector to reduce emissions in, we have goals in this draft plan to increase energy efficiency 16% for electricity and 12% for natural gas. The strategy identified that will help us get there is energy efficiency. And then there's progress measures. So how are we going to figure out that we're meeting our goals? We're going to look at electricity and natural gas consumption annually. And then for each one identified, there's some expected benefits. So not only are there environmental benefits for improving energy efficiency, we also have potential improved building quality, reduced costs for customers or residents, and jobs and economic development. And then just to give another idea, this really demonstrates exactly which strategies will have the greatest impact in getting us to our goals. So even though a lot of the strategies are important, they don't all have the same impact in reducing emissions. So in particular, solar citywide, whether it's rooftop or ground mount, and also energy efficiency are the most influential in helping us meet these goals for 19.4% reduction for energy and built environment. So all that to say is that we used the data we had from emissions, and we really modeled exactly what would need to happen in order to meet the goals that we've set out for ourselves to this point as a community. And then there's actions that are recommended by a variety of other communities that have implemented it, that have been proven to help get us there. So this is just kind of an overview of the whole thing. I recognize it's quite a comprehensive document, but the top shows the different mitigation chapters. So energy, built environment, we need a 19.4% reduction in emissions, transportation and land use, waste management, and water and wastewater. And then the most influential or important strategies in these other sections. So ranging from accelerating on-site solar installations, increasing recycling diversion, increasing organics diversion. So everything in the top section will be necessary to reduce pollution. Everything in this bottom blue section is important to ensure that the community is ready for the coming impacts of climate change. So I think that, there's a lot of conversation that can be had about any of these particular actions, but we can see as we look to other larger cities and cities across the country that these are pretty proven strategies to help really drive those pollution levels down. And then just go back to metrics, just to ensure that we are tracking exactly the progress of how the plan's being implemented for each of the strategies. Again, there's those particular metrics that are listed there. So we created this survey feedback form for folks. So if they're interested in providing feedback on the plan, which is open for public input, we've got this link here. It's also on the city website. And then I have my email here if people want to provide direct feedback to my email address. But I really would like to get questions or feedback from council members. This is obviously just a draft, and we're circulating it among members of the public and community organizations to get more in-depth feedback on particular chapters. But that I covered quite a bit, so I will allow anyone that either, is it public input, Matt, or?
Yeah, we're going to go with council question,
Okay.
or committee member questions to start, and then we will also move to the public and take any comment or questions from the public. We are going to stick to the typical council format of not a direct Q&A, but council members could take up public questions that members of the public have in the period after that. So yeah, if that wraps up your presentation, Ms. Travis, very much appreciated. And we'll go ahead and move to questions from committee members at this time. Councilmember Rallo, go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks, Lauren. We've talked about this a little bit, and I'm curious to kind of throw it out to the group to see what they think about it. So we know it's accounted for, in terms of transportation, emissions, building envelope and so forth. But it seems to me that as a community, we don't really know what isn't accounted for. And maybe the report needs to make clear what that is. So for instance, if we had full accounting of climate impacts for the community, we would count goods imported into the community and, the climate footprint that is associated with those goods through the embedded energy in it, through the manufacture or processing or the transportation and everything that, adds to a climate impact. I doubt the communities do this, but the reason I think it's important is because I think that in terms of not only mitigation, but also adaptation, it's important to concentrate on what we can do locally in terms of a local economy to have a circular flow of services and goods as opposed to heavy on imports, because it's certainly going to cut down on climate impact, but it's also going to have other benefits associated with recirculating wealth and so forth. And, local food is a good example of this, to the extent that we can, increase the amount of local food produced, we're cutting emissions, and that should be counted for. But right now, we don't really count for the embedded energy and the climate footprint of imported goods. Is that something that we should address, or at least say in the introduction of this report, describe how we haven't addressed that, and maybe that's something for a future report?
I think over time, the accounting is becoming more sophisticated. For instance, you had mentioned regenerative agriculture or, carbon sequestration when we were talking about this at BCOS. I think that right now we don't necessarily have the data for this. I know that Indiana University has done a ton of tracking of their food purchasing recently, and that is going to be really helpful to see how they end up trying to work on shifting their food purchasing to be closer. Whether that ends up being quantified in emission standards, I'm not sure yet. I think there could be perhaps a disclaimer that says that we're trying to focus on Indiana grown foods or foods grown within a certain distance from Bloomington as a proxy for reducing the distance that goods are traveled. But yeah, I think we could add something specifically, I think definitely in the food chapter, that really demonstrates that while we don't know the entire impact of our purchasing, that would make up for a very large portion of our emissions that we're responsible for.
Okay, great. I have more questions, but I'll leave those for others.
Sure. Yeah, we can kind of go with one at a time for now and just alternate among committee members. If Councilmembers Rosenberger or Piedmont Smith have questions. Councilmember Piedmont Smith, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I have not made my way through the whole report, but some observations from the first 30 pages or so. I find that there are citations missing, like there are facts stated, studies cited that then are not referenced anywhere, so nobody could go and look at those more carefully. I'm sorry, Councilmember Flaherty, is this just questions or comments?
It's meant to be question period, okay. Yes.
Okay.
Perhaps you can ask about that.
All right, well, I have a question, more specific question. So when you talk about the cost savings, I really do not understand how those are calculated. And it's not in the appendix or anything. It looks to me like in the introduction on page 19, there's that blue box with transportation savings potential, energy efficiency, and renewable energy savings potential, waste reduction savings. And it just seems like we're double counting some things. Like, for example, the energy efficiency, isn't that also counted in social costs? It's just a lot of numbers without explanation. Can you maybe explain that a little bit more thoroughly, just so that we have a better understanding?
Yeah, well, I would agree that we can add definitely more citations in that section. Let me pull up what you're looking at. Transportation savings potential. So I think that it's might be a little bit confusing. It does definitely reference this part about in the previous page about benefits of climate action. I will go back and ensure that those values are accurate from a regional standpoint as well, that they're not overestimates based on, you know, potential savings in places that might not be a good colliery. But I'm not going to speak specifically to that without checking on it. If I can respond to you in writing, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, you know, for a layperson who has not studied this issue, it's just like you're pulling these numbers out of a hat. I know you're not. I know that you're not. But so that further explanation would be really helpful, I think.
Okay.
Additional questions? Councilmember Rosenberger, go ahead.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a good presentation. I'm also still working through, I kind of bop around in the whole draft right now. Maybe touching on what Councilmember Rallo talked about with local food. I understand the reasoning that there aren't quantitative numbers associated with these goals, but I guess it bums me out a little bit because I think we prioritize like getting to numbers more than something just like increased local agriculture. And just like kind of thinking about how we'll get 1% of our food right from this region or something. And to me, that's like a great space for growing a local food economy and growing resilience and like climate action, right? So I don't know, is there any chance like we might put some numbers on these mitigation goals, like the blue ones on the one page you showed, so that we have like baseline? I mean, I guess you have baseline data throughout the document, but so then we know where we want to go so that we prioritize those kind of moves. Because I agree that the more local food we have, the less we're transporting in. And so like that is a big, and I get it, like it's hard to tell like where the emissions are coming from, like in terms of transportation, I guess I would assume, but right, like is there a way we can prioritize that kind of stuff with more quantitative goals, I guess?
Yeah, I think specifically in the local food section, we do have information about how much is purchased from local farmers in Monroe County, and that would be good context, I think, to add to that section, because even if it's not a specific emissions value, you know that if we're purchasing more from the county by proxy, that would then be reducing the distance that other food has traveled. So that, and also I think that helps sort of incentivize what you're saying is that it's a, positive. We're not only just trying to reduce emissions, we're building resilience in another area. So.
Okay, great. Yeah, I might then follow up with that afterwards.
Okay.
That sounds good though. Thank you.
I'll go ahead with one. Correct me if I'm wrong, Lauren, but it looked like, to my memory anyway, this is the first time the city is in any sort of planning document or commitment making some sort of commitment to attempting to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Is that correct?
It was in the vision statement and the sustainability action plan to work towards carbon neutrality. And that's a point of discussion with you all as well. I mean, nothing is set in stone in this document. It's a draft. So the dates in different cities have been different. I mean, like I mentioned, Ann Arbor's trying to do neutrality by 2030. Other people have said 2050. Just based on kind of how much they're producing already and the rate of expected reduction. So there's nothing that explicit that we've stated, by X date, we're going to be carbon neutral to this point. So that as having that as part of the goal statement in the feedback form for the community members, I've asked like, what degree do you agree with this statement? If you don't agree with it, please let you know why. Because people might think, oh, that's too far in the future. Some other people might think that's too stringent, just trying to get a sense of an appropriate time scale for what needs to basically happen in terms of emissions reduction.
So this is sort of like a loose, I'm going to follow up on the same question if that's okay. And I would encourage other council members to do the same. Like if, sorry, I should have said earlier, if like, it's like the same question, sort of clarifying. So it's kind of like a soft commitment. Is that like an appropriate way to think about it, or like still yet to be finalized? Like, would you consider like are we going to have a very explicit sort of 2030 and 2050 target as part of this plan, like more explicit perhaps than is on the top of page 1-14, which says, for instance, the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals guiding the sustainability plan are to reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions 40% over the 2005 baseline by 2030, and then to achieve carbon neutral by 2050. So that like is a statement, like a commitment statement, but I think it like, if that's what we're doing and where we're going, which I would support, like I think maybe it needs to be more explicit in the document. Am I thinking or understanding this correctly? Thinking about?
Yeah, so I would say that there's an explicit reduction goal, 40% by 2030. So that represents an additional 25% in the next 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then the 2050 goal, because it's a little bit further out, 30 years, being neutrality is a little bit softer in that it's not a percentage the same way, like you're working towards zero, but the midpoint goals that we could set in between there might be different between 2030 and 2050. So the speed at which we're trying to get to zero might change as we determine how quickly we can reduce to that point. And to your second point about it being more explicit what the goal is, I think that is fair. We could reprioritize it in the executive summary, and it could be pretty like at the beginning of the section as well.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Additional questions? We can just keep going in around the same order if that's until we run out, if that's how folks want to proceed. So Councilmember Morello, go ahead.
Thank you. Lauren, I just was thinking about our discussion last time on sequestration, and we're heavy into planting tree cover. And we talked about this a little bit before. The report mentions things like grazing land, cropland, and so forth, and then tree cover as strategies for sequestration. It mentions biochar, which is good in a couple places, but it doesn't mention prairie. And I think that this is another mitigation strategy, actually adaptation as well, to be not only just focused on growing tree biomass, but prairie roots go down many meters, and in some studies, they sequester the equivalent carbon of a forest. So given the fact that tree cover is great, but if we're concerned about biodiversity, we might want to be thinking about what we do in say meadows or open spaces and things like that. And if we can be planting prairie, we can be sequestering carbon to a much greater extent than say if it's just turf grass or something like that. And it has the added benefit of pollinator and forage and things like that for wildlife. So do you think that there's a place in the report where we can put some emphasis on planting prairie? I mean, we're already doing that in various planters in the city. Mm-hmm. I just don't want that to be lost as a potential strategy, because it may be that we have a place where planting a lot of trees may not be appropriate, but if we were to plant, some prairie forbs or grasses, we could do the equivalent of planting trees.
Yeah, I think there's some actions related to increasing native species, and I think there could just be explicitly talking about prairie within that section and the sequestration related to that. So that would be in the ecosystem health section. In particular, I think would be a good place for that. But
And maybe under the glossary where it, we define various terms, and, having an entry for prairie to explain to people, why it's important, and why to distinguish that from, say, other ornamental plants, or, perennials of some kind or other, that these have unique qualities, like very, very deep roots, extensive root storage.
I think that would also be a great partnership strategy with the county too, in areas where there might be a little more space that aren't well suited to other types of, development, or et cetera.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's my Reed Smith. You can go ahead if you have more.
Yeah, Lauren, I wanted to ask about a couple of tables in the introduction.
Okay.
So on page 113, 1-13, it has this, the heading of citywide greenhouse gas emission forecast. And then the two paragraphs talk about business as usual, the business as usual case, like if we don't make any changes, this is what we can expect as far as emissions. But then the table, and I don't know if you can bring it up, so we can all take a look at it together, or I could. It seems to show quite a big reduction from 2008 to 2050. And this is right after we've talked about business as usual. So there's no way this can be business as usual. This amount of reduction, especially the orange is electricity. So what is this table actually showing us?
Which the tables on this page?
No, the one you had initially with the big orange piece in the middle. Yeah, that one.
Mm-hmm. Are you asking why the trend moves downward regardless of?
Well, I interpreted this as being the business as usual model.
Yeah.
So how could it possibly decrease that much if we're not making any changes?
So business as usual is assuming that there's no change in policies, but the way that the market is moving with decarbonization, regardless of any sort of policy intervention, would indicate that things like solar are becoming cheaper. So the grid would decarbonize at a certain rate. And you can kind of see this at the state level, where we have no mandates right now that the energy mix be a certain percentage of renewables versus non-renewables. It's just moving at the speed that economic trends would dictate. So that's why it does decrease, simply because in most cases, if something's cheaper, it's adopted more quickly. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that will happen at the speed necessary to react to climate change. So if, like for instance, in Bloomington, the presence of the solarized information sessions have helped a lot more people get solar more quickly, has been a way to accelerate that trend that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Does that answer your question?
So what are we looking at here? This table, it doesn't have a heading. I don't know if this is Bloomington, Monroe County. What is it? It's just very confusing to me.
Okay, it's City of Bloomington, so only within the administrative boundaries. It's basically where emissions were back in 2008, and if supposing that we did nothing differently, where we would be in 2050, if trends continued in the way that they are. So if we're concerned about reducing to a certain target, which would be necessary if we're doing our fair share of emissions reduction, we would not arrive at that point without doing more, essentially is what it's saying. We can put more context to that, definitely.
So is 2008 the baseline that's used throughout the document? 2008 emissions?
2008 is the first year that we have the utility data. So anything before then is just a forecast, but I can make sure that's consistent.
But I'm just asking, you know, so the rest of the document, when we talk about reducing by 40%, reducing, you know, this by certain
It's
number of metric tons, is that always from 2008 levels?
It's from 2005.
From 2005 levels. Okay. Yeah, all those things need to be here so people can understand the context of the tables.
Okay.
Please, thank you.
Councilmember Rosenberger.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about transportation a little bit, if that's okay. I think some of my questions seem pretty in the weeds, but I'm just trying to understand some of the tables as well, or graphics. So on 2-4, okay, it says today our single occupancy vehicle use is 62.6%. Our target in 10 years is 59.8%. And then the goal on TL1-A, reduce single occupancy automobile use by 7%. Is that different, 7%? I thought I did the math and it was not that, but I'm just like, maybe I'm just not seeing something. I mostly think I'm not seeing something here. So
you're looking at the strategy reducing the vehicle use by 7%.
Yeah.
You were referencing that to something that's further.
Yeah, on page 2-4, above the bike on the street graphic, is that 62.6% to 59.8?
So today's target versus 2030, so that is not 7%.
Okay.
I
mean, it's a very minor thing, but I'm just like, am I doing the math right or not right? Because
I'll check that.
Okay, just because I'm like, is that where it comes from, the 7%? Or is that where the 59.8 comes from? I don't really know, but okay. And then, so all of these targets for 2030 are based on the goal at the top that is saying how much we need to reduce our vehicle miles traveled and everything else. So it's coming from the top round graphic of like, it's 11% right now and we want to get it down. Okay, so that let me look at my notes real quick. I'm sorry, I like keep going back and forth between these things. Do you think we'll be prioritizing reducing rather than changing to a renewable resource? Just the part I was reading about advocating or like encouraging electric cars over gas powered cars. I get that electric cars are better, of course, but no car, you know, or like to decrease the need for so many cars is best, because obviously making cars is bad for the world. So, I mean, do you think we'll be promoting reducing over buying renewables?
Yeah, I mean, essentially in all of these sections, conservation is the best strategy. So conserving trips would be number one, or just reducing, you know, the number of trips you need to take, whether even if you have the same vehicle is better. So conservation first. After that, I mean, we're looking at increasing transit utilization as being really important. And obviously you can fit more people in a given trip. And so when you look at the counts of how are people getting to work, I think there's a lot of progress that could be made specifically in commuting. So whether people are carpooling, etc. And then for some of the smaller trips that would be better suited for things like, you know, bicycling, transit, walking. It's kind of a level of priority in the same way that you would have with, you know, waste reduction. The best thing is to not produce it to begin with. And then you kind of go of degrees of, you know, less bad from there. So
Okay, yes, that makes sense. And then just like a follow-up for reading this, do you think, are these strategies like in order of importance or not?
If I can pull up just as a way to interpret this really quickly. So at the end of each chapter, and this may not be super, self-explanatory, on the right, you have all of the strategies that were identified that would reduce, and then the size of each relative one shows the amount of importance attributed to that. So in the transportation section, it's going to show how much that's directly going to impact reducing pollution. So at the top, you can barely see it says increase solar on city facilities. That's because we've essentially maximized our roof space. So then you go down to the next one. The importance of accelerating on-site solar across the city is that there's many roofs that don't have solar. So that one would have a much larger impact. If we focus more on that one, we'll have a much larger return in terms of emissions reduction. There's the same thing as well in transportation. And that's where you can see kind of what is going to move the bar in terms of progress. That doesn't mean that these other things are not important. They're just showing what the impacts specifically on pollution are. So you could say, pollution reduction is not the most important component, equity is, or, public health is. So there's just, different benefits that aren't as easy to quantify. This just shows the quantity of pollution reduction that you could expect if we were to fully implement each strategy.
Okay, thank you. That's good to know.
I'll go ahead with the question. At this point in the draft and looking forward to a final document in the next few months, what type of, what types of things might change based on council member feedback and input, as well as feedback and input from residents? Is it more kind of the things we've been talking about, adding titles to certain charts, or clarifying, where the data comes from on something, or sources, that sort of stuff? Or is there also some room on, strategies or actions or that type of thing as well?
Yeah, I think that there's room on strategy and actions, especially the actions, because it kind of goes, the goals are things that we definitely need to do, but they tend to be broader. So, those are things that are fundamental bedrock to getting the plan's objectives met. The strategies get a little bit finer, how we're going to get there. The actions, there's a lot of room to say, perhaps one organization doesn't think that that's the best way to approach it because they've already tried something similar. That's a sort of feedback that's helpful in knowing, that's probably not a great road to go down. We've already gone down that road with our particular business, etc. Or organization. Council member feedback, I would say it sort of could come in a lot of ways. Alignment, do you see something that's out of alignment with other policies that you're looking at across the spectrum of things you're working on? Accuracy, we're going to make changes in, there's places that there's still typos, etc. We wanted to get a draft out so that there was more time for community feedback, but I understand it's not perfect. And then also just a lot of you have experience on council, how are people going to interpret or respond? Your stakeholders, your community members respond to different sections. If people feel really strongly in support of one area of the plan and not in another, is there a way that we could change that or adopt a different framing that would be better received? I mean, I think that there's going to be some people that are in opposition to doing a climate action plan at all, but then there might be other people that say, I'm really broadly supportive of energy efficiency. I just don't particularly like this action. I don't think it is well suited to the community. So I think if you look at the feedback form, there's some sections that ask, do you support this particular action? And those are ones that are high impact. And then you get to the end of it and there's a broader response with the drop down with chapters that maybe someone has a more of an open response, general feedback about the plan that doesn't fit very neatly into a small box. And so kind of balancing those two things, maybe people just want to quickly give a thumbs up or thumbs down to the direction it's going. It's in alignment with where they think the community should be going with the climate action plan versus maybe they have something really in depth to ask about, or they really just care about one chapter in particular.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Rala, if you have more, go ahead.
Yes, I had a question, Lauren, about making this current, that is post-COVID.
Okay.
It's really clear right now that any trepidation that a lot of employers had about teleworking have sort of been put to rest. It seems to be working. And it seems, I was just reading something the other day about how maybe 25 to 30% of jobs will be teleworking in the future, simply because why accommodate space that you need to rent if you own a business when people can work at home and you get just as much productivity, right? So I wonder if the report needs to at least acknowledge this at some point. And that would certainly, you know, the implications are, you know, reduce vehicle miles traveled through commuting and so forth. But I think just because we're in a different world right now, that possibility should be acknowledged in the report somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, I think that looking at trends that have happened even over the last 7 months, some of them I think are more fundamental shifts than others. We had seen our vehicle traffic decline precipitously. Now it's, you know, back up. So the question is, where is it kind of going to level out at as people return to a more normal level of activity?
Yep. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go back to a question that Councilmember Rosenbarger asked about. If we could, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the bar chart at the end of the transportation section that you were talking about, where we see which strategies can reduce how much emissions. Because I'm a little confused by that. I'm sorry.
No.
So I'm looking at this, and it you know, the biggest part of that blue and then green bar is reduce citywide off-road and lawn equipment emissions. So does that mean that, I mean, I find it hard to believe, but I could be wrong, that, you know, 2/3 of the emissions we can reduce through the transportation sector are going to be in off-road and lawn equipment?
So this is because like leaf blowers, lawnmowers actually produce a lot of pollution relative to what you would think. For the relative size of it, this is based on a Environmental Protection Agency model. So we can put an asterisk next to this as well to clarify more specifically, you know, what's included in off-road and lawn equipment. It's more than you would think. I mean, some cities have banned, you know, electric lawnmowers and leaf blowers simply because of the amount of pollution they create. But the coloring too, I think, could be a little clearer just to show the difference.
Yeah, and maybe adding a number like this many tons or this percentage of the total reduction is due to strategy TL1C or TL1D.
Okay. Yeah.
It's like several of these tables, I find it needs a little more explanation.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of feedback is great, so that before it goes to full council, that it's as accessible as possible.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Of course.
Go ahead.
Well, okay. maybe it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's to be a follow-up, but it is on transportation. So at the beginning of the transportation chapter, that first page of text, it says, in Bloomington, transportation accounts for 27.3% of citywide greenhouse gas emissions. And then in the very next sentence, in the next paragraph, it says the transportation sector contributes 15.4% of citywide greenhouse gas emissions. Am I crazy, or are those contradictory statements? Or, you know, I could be crazy and they're contradictory statements. That's possible there.
You're not crazy. I will check on why that is. I think I don't know what happened there, to be honest. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for looking into it.
Yeah.
I think it was, just a point of clarification, I text searched 15.4 and it seems like maybe it was a placeholder, something that's mentioned also in the energy and built environment and transportation in the same way, and that doesn't line up with the numbers after it in the body of the text. So yeah, maybe just a typo, but sorry. Go ahead, Councilmember Rosenberger. Sorry to interrupt.
It's okay. I was going to ask about, in relation to whichever number is correct. I have two questions. They're not that related, but the first one is in the very beginning, page 0-3, the reduction share by sector. So when it says 11.9% for transportation, that means we want to reduce that 27% by 11%. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's a pie chart of all the emissions, and then if we made a pie chart of just transportation emissions, we want to reduce that by that. So it ends up to be over time a percentage of the whole, but the sector specific goals have their own associated percentages.
Right, and we're not changing. Wait, or are we trying to get transportation from 27% to 11.9% of the whole?
Well, 11% reduction of transportation.
Oh, transportation, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Then just, this is more like a high level question from the beginning. How do we account for the decrease in emissions from 2008 to 2018? Because you were saying our population increased, so it's, I don't know, we're not just increasing greenhouse gas emissions from more people necessarily, but like what do we point to certain things that we've done, or do we think it just happened because people are staying home? I'm just making that up, but.
No, I mean, there's some things like fuel switching. So like the heating plant at IU used to be all coal and they switched to natural gas. So that accounts for some of it. Some buildings are becoming more efficient. Fuel has become more efficient. So there's some trends there. And then there's actual, things that we know. There's 400 more households that have solar on their roofs. The city has worked to increase panels on our own roofs to just reduce that overall number. And so things have become both more efficient and people have switched away from the more polluting option. So that kind of drives the trend down.
Okay. And just following up, is any part of our projected, 2050 net zero, is it saying some of this is going to happen naturally, or is it us saying we're going to, is it accounting for increase in efficiency, or just what we have in the plan?
Yeah, so that's where the business as usual graph that Isabel, Councilmember Isabel was looking at. So basically some decrease would happen over time regardless of plan implementation, but we would not arrive at the same point essentially.
Okay, that's the blue filled in area, business as usual.
Yeah, I mean, I could pull up the chart, but that's what that graph is explaining. So
Okay.
if you did that globally, you would know that we would definitely overshoot the amount of emissions and it would exceed our capacity. So.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I'm actually going to follow up on that same graphic on 03. It took me a minute thinking through this earlier when I was reading. The 11.9% from transportation, for instance, that is neither, correct me if I'm wrong, that is not the percent reduction in the transportation sector by 2030. And it's also not the share of total emissions that we expect in 2030. Rather, it is the percent, I mean, exactly what it says there, the share of total 2030 reductions. That is, if we took all the 2030 reductions in metric tons, say, and totaled them, the portion coming from transportation savings would be 11.9%. But that 11.9% figure neither is the same as the actual percent reduction in the transportation sector, nor is it the percentage of emissions that the transportation sector represents in our economy at that time. That's too many words. I probably lost. Does that make sense? It's these do get confusing because like a percent reduction is not the same as like the percent share of the total reductions for the city. Those are two different numbers for each sector. And I'm not sure if there's like an easier way to clarify this in graphics, but I think it is going to be confusing for folks. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
To make sure that is clear. I mean, I think that the overarching goal is perhaps the easiest one, like from 2018, reduce overall by a quarter, and then by 2050 to 0%. Where you start getting in the weeds is more with the inventory about, you know, as we look at all transportation emissions, we need to cut all of those by this amount in order to get to the ultimate goal. But the fact that it is quantitative and a percentage of various things, I can see how that's confusing and find a way to clarify that more.
Yeah, I don't think it's easy to do. It's just like there's multiple percentage representations for each sector that mean different things. But okay, I'll stop there for that one. Thanks. Councilmember Morello, go ahead.
I'm muted. I think I'm done for now.
Okay. I
don't know if we have public that we need to hear from.
Yeah, let's cut off council member questions or committee member questions by 8:20. I have a few left anyway, and then go to the public at that point, and then we can always come back if there's more. Either Councilmember Piedmont Smith, you can go ahead if you have more.
Well, I wanted to add on to what you were saying, Councilmember Flaherty, that there are a lot of charts and numbers and percentages, and I was going to suggest just cutting some of them. And we don't have to know every interpretation of every piece of data, you know, what portion it is of everything else. I just think it's confusing. For example, that little donut chart on page 03 that Councilmember Flaherty was referring to. I mean, I don't think it's necessary. I think it just muddles things. So you might consider that.
Did you have another question at this point, Councilmember Piedmont Smith, or should we go to Councilmember Rosenberger?
I have many questions because I didn't understand a lot of the charts, so I can maybe meet separately with Lauren about that.
And I imagine, we'll have the ability, of course, to follow up via email and submit some written questions, which I figured for some of the more detailed stuff we may all do. But more at this point, Councilmember Rosenberger?
No, I am okay for right now. I think I'm getting too in the weeds on it, so I'm good.
Okay, I have maybe just a couple other high-level ones, if that's okay. I guess it is because I'm the chair. I said it's okay. Okay. I guess a couple questions related to the initial actions that are under the strategies. is it a correct interpretation that the initial actions that are listed for each strategy are meant to be essentially comprehensive? That if all of the actions that are listed were implemented fully, that we would meet the projected savings for that, given that strategy and goal. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, so those are based on, in almost every case, things that have been successfully implemented in another city. So I would say it's correct that if you complete all of those, and that's why the yearly reporting is important. So if we were not moving in the direction at the speed that we were anticipating, you could reevaluate the actions under the strategy. And that's true also with the sustainability action plan. Sometimes conditions change and things like the world changes in a way that couldn't have been anticipated, or it's not possible. But the strategy still stands as being important. So I'm just thinking of, for instance, the tree canopy goal, perhaps, and it, increased tree canopy 3%. You can also be more aggressive in one strategy and it compensates for another one. So if we have greater success in implementation in one area, then it would sort of offset other areas as well.
Thanks. And related to that, I know these actions were selected among a sort of menu or suite of possible things. And I would imagine also that certainly beyond 2030, but also in the interim, based on how things are going and how effective the strategies are and the actions are, that we may need to modify them. So add other actions or take different actions. Are those actions available in some sort of could they be available in some sort of appendix, or what's the public maybe would be interested in that as well, but certainly as a member of the city's legislative body, just thinking about, I know there's regulatory solutions that are a part of this, but there's probably others that are not, and just curious about those and what that will look like over time in terms of our ability to add or adjust actions, and if those are available now, or a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot of different ways to reach the same solution. You can see that in different climate action plans across the country, where a lot of these broader strategies are pretty common. Most cities are working to decarbonize their electricity grid as a major way, but then based on the particular conditions of the state or city that they live in, some things might be taken off the menu, as you call it. So, and then you're left with what's possible in your regulatory environment. In terms of trying to get a sense of the entire scope of what's possible, I think the best way to do that is to look at cities of roughly our size in the same area. And that's kind of why I picked the ones at the beginning of the presentation that have commonalities. Dubuque just finished their plan, so I think that would be a great place to check as well if you're curious about someone that's fully completed this process, and actually is the same consultant body too. So there's a lot of relationship between there. And then also, if you're looking for something that's more aggressive, Ann Arbor's plan is pretty aggressive to try to get to zero by 2030. So that kind of shows the scope of investment necessary in order to go at that speed as well. And then there's other cities that are at a different point in the planning process. So there's most, but not all cities have some version of planning that's in the works. So if anyone's curious about what this looks like, I think especially in the last 2 years, there's been a lot more cities that have undergone this process.
Okay, thank you. If other council members are okay with it, we could stop council member questions for now and go ahead and go to the public. So let's do that. If there are members of the public present that would like to comment or ask a question, now would be the time to do so. You can use the raised hand function in Zoom to indicate that you'd like to speak, or if you don't know how to do that, you can send a message via the chat function to Stephen Lucas, who is the meeting host, and we can get your comment that way. We'll give it just a bit here. And as Ms. Travis reminded us too in her presentation, there is a feedback form on the Climate Action Plan webpage, which is another place to leave feedback, especially for anybody watching this on CATS now or later.
And I would say this is not the only opportunity to engage with this. We will be discussing it again at BCOS. So if you're interested in coming to the Commission on Sustainability meeting, it's another place where we will be discussing this in depth as well.
Great. Any messages, Stephen?
Sandy, no.
Okay. Anyone's welcome to chime in still if they have missed out, but I think it looks like no public comment this evening. Let's see. We'll go ahead and go back to committee members then for any additional questions they have at this time, or if folks would like to make comments, I think either is appropriate now. That's okay. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, Lauren, I was wondering if you could walk us through another of the charts. It's the one at the very end of the introduction, so it's page 1-15. It's a wedge diagram, and I don't understand wedge diagrams. I even tried to Google it, and I've got nowhere. So can you explain what this is showing us?
Is this the one?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, I don't know, can you see my cursor or no?
Yeah.
Okay. We're starting out here with our emissions, and if we did nothing, the trend would be that we would have a slight reduction, but not substantially. So that indicates, you have some growth, which increases energy use overall. And this shows that the most that needs to happen is in the energy sector. So most of the action required to reduce our emissions will be related to reducing electricity use from buildings. And then you have a smaller sliver or a smaller sort of percentage of the total emissions that are related to transportation and land use, and then even smaller for water and wastewater. So water is a very small percentage. We can increase conservation and electricity related to treating. And then waste, again, like reducing the amount of things landfilled. But the reason that the wedge for energy is so large is simply because coal-based power is massively polluting. And so that's the focus sort of making sure that we're meeting our emission goals right there. So,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if that clarified anything.
Yeah, so I guess at a minimum, this needs to be labeled somehow, because I'm a college educated person, and I could not understand what this was telling me. And does it need to be a wedge diagram? I mean, what benefits do the dotted lines have here?
It's to simply designate time. So 2020, 2030, get down to the target.
But I mean,
yeah,
if you just use the X and Y axis, it seems like that is, I don't know.
It could be a line graph too. Yeah, we can think about whether a line graph or no graph or whatever might be best. But
I mean, the information
to know that.
Yeah, the information you conveyed is interesting, to see, how much of it is energy. It's very hard to see any of the other colors distinctly. So
Sure.
Maybe also going up close into that, so we can make a distinction between the water, wastewater, transportation, etc. But
Sure.
thank you for going through it.
Yeah.
Additional questions or comments from committee members? Councilmember Rallo, go ahead. I think you're
Sorry.
still, yep.
Yes, I'm good. Lauren, could you put that chart up again? I just noticed something you might want to correct. If you scroll up a little bit. So the dotted line, right vertical, right down the center is the year 2020. That's our present point, right? Actually scroll the other way. Yep. And at the bottom, it says 2018. And so it's a bit confusing. Is it 2018 or 2020?
I think
maybe 20, go ahead.
2018 is when we have the inventory for, so it should be consistent from top to bottom. Yep.
Okay, so what does the 2020 refer to, that dotted line? Is that right? That's how I interpret it. And then at the very bottom of the graph, on the x-axis in the middle, it says 2018. And what does that refer to? Does that refer to the dotted line as well?
It's supposed to be either 2018 or 2020, top to bottom. I think the discrepancy is because the inventory number was created in 2018, and then it should say 2018 at the top as well.
Okay. I mean, I think that the 2020 seems to precede the year 2018. It lends confusion. Sure. Otherwise, I wasn't confused by this chart. I found it interpretable, but I also agree. What I do agree about is that what it is displaying is that obviously energy is the bulk, transportation land use is a tiny wedge, and everything else is so small as to not even be almost visible. Although I think that it's useful to have it there just in terms of a comparison. Anyway, just besides those labels, 2020, 2018, I found rather confusing. Sure. Thanks. Yep.
Councilmember Rosenberger, did you have additional questions or comment at this time? Or questions, let's stick with, I guess, since we're still all kind of asking. No? Okay. I think mine might be all of the more detailed variety as well, and we can figure out a way to coordinate those among committee members here to get back to you within a few weeks. Okay. Let's see. Oh, I did have a question just about emissions tracking. Are we still planning to do that on a every other year basis? Is that
that's a anticipation, unless the data was for some reason not to be available.
Okay. Okay, I think that's it. Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yes, so what's the timeline for completion? So how soon do you need our comments? Or
I would say if Matt could compile them and send them by December 1st, that would be ideal.
Mm-hmm. We can do that.
But we don't have a date set yet for the plan to go in front of council. So if you need more time, we could always push it back. I'm more concerned about making sure that everyone's feedback is included than having a certain date for passage.
Okay. If there are any more questions from committee members, we could take those, or if not, we could also move to any final comments folks have. Let's go ahead with comments then, if y'all like. Any final comments? Councilmember Rallo.
Well, just to say that I think that it's an impressive report, and I give you a lot of credit, Lauren, for tackling a very complicated, subject, and being on top of all of that, and being able to communicate it. So I think it's a wonderful step forward.
Thank you. we'll get there too with some of the changes, but.
Councilmember Piedmont Smith.
Yeah, I guess I'll add my thanks. I definitely think this is a very important document, and we need to get it right, and we need to make sure that the average person can understand it. Yep. And that it's accessible. But I think this is a great draft. A lot of work has gone into it. I would like to see more of the, show your work, how you got to some of those numbers, especially the dollar savings. Sure. But I think, this is a great start, and I appreciate all your work on it.
Thank you.
Councilmember Rosenbarger, did you have any final comments?
Well, I'll just say thank you, Lauren, and I'll follow up with some other things or coordinate with the other committee members. Yeah, it's pretty obvious a lot of work has gone into this. I appreciate a lot of the graphics. I want to, at some point, talk about how we will implement this in our decision-making processes, just moving forward in terms of thinking about something like the convention center, right? Like maybe it won't happen at all, but if it does, how do we implement these goals or strategies into something like that? I think that'll be good for all of us, some kind of rubric or process moving forward. But it makes me excited to see all this written down. Thank you.
And I'll add a final comment as well. Yes, thank you very much, especially to you, Ms. Travis, and I know a lot of folks in city staff, not just in your department, but across a variety of departments. We're part of the team, as well as some community members. I see Ms. Hedden on the call, and I believe Ms. Morgan with the chamber was as well at some point. I know they contributed as well, so definitely appreciate all the work and input that went into this. I agree that it's a very impressive document in its scope, certainly much more detailed than our initial sustainability action plan, and I think that's reflective of municipalities, across the country taking this issue much more seriously in recent years, and the capacity building just around how to tackle this at the local level is really expanding. So that's all great to see. And yeah, getting this right is really important, which will include lots of ongoing monitoring and evaluation. And I know the plan anticipates that, and it's building those types of things in. So that's great. As I was reading initially, I had a lot of questions related to sort of timescale of actions and who is responsible for implementation and various things like that. And I know that's forthcoming and being finalized as well in the context of implementation. So that's great. I agree a little bit with, I know there's some things in there about how we make decisions and building in an analysis of, anticipated climate impacts of certain transportation projects or things like that. And maybe it's something we need to be a little more explicit about just as we develop policies around this, even considering, fleet replacement and things. Considering social cost of carbon is probably something we should be doing when we're doing some sort of cost benefit analysis on, replacement of equipment and that sort of thing, as well as other capital projects and investments. So the plan, calls out social cost of carbon is something that we should be considering in savings. And I think if we can incorporate that in decision making around capital expenses and, again, equipment and other things like that, it would help us to do what that graphic in the executive summary says, which is to lead by example. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. Just one final thought, kind of on the point that Councilmember Rosenberger brought up earlier, and Councilmember Rallo also. Areas where it's harder to quantify the benefits, for instance, from the local food economy or relocalizing various things. Perhaps we could look at reporting emission savings or setting targets for emission savings that, even though they're outside the scope of what we track in our emissions inventory. And sorry, just a quick aside as a question, is that correct that we don't include embedded emissions from food in our scope 3 emissions in the inventory? Okay, we do not, just like travel. Okay. So yeah, I mean, those are real savings, of course. And yeah, wouldn't want those types of opportunities to be overlooked. So if maybe there is a way to think a little bit about, even if it's just illustrative, if we go from 1% to 5% local food economy, here's the type of actual greenhouse gas emissions reductions that would look like or something. But yeah, I have some other thoughts and questions, more detailed things that we'll work on coordinating among the committee and getting back to you before December 1. Sounds like a good deadline to me. Also, we'll continue to put this out in the community and work with channels to get additional public feedback on this. But yeah, very much appreciate your presentation tonight, Ms. Travis, and all your hard work on this, along with the others who've worked on it. Unless there are any additional questions or comments from folks, I think we can probably adjourn at this point. Any other
Move
final
adjournment.
thoughts? Okay. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you all.